In 1917, the armies on the Western Front continued to change their fighting methods, due to the consequences of increases in firepower, greater numbers of automatic weapons, the decentralization of authority and the integration of specialized branches, equipment and techniques into the traditional structures of infantry, artillery and cavalry, tanks, railways, aircraft, lorries, chemicals, concrete and steel, photography, wireless and advances in medical science increased in importance in all of the armies, as did the influence of the material constraints of geography, climate, demography and economics. All of the armies encountered growing manpower shortages, caused by the need to replace the losses of 1916 and by the competing demands for labor of civilian industry and agriculture. The consequences of dwindling manpower were particularly marked in the German and French armies, which made considerable changes in the methods during the year, with the object of simultaneously pursuing military strategic objectives and limiting casualties. The French army began the year with a return to the strategy of decisive battle, using the methods pioneered at the Battle of Verdun in December 1916, to break through the German defenses on the Western Front and return to maneuver warfare, but ended the year recovering from the disastrous result. The German army attempted to avoid the high infantry losses of 1916 by withdrawing to new, deeper and dispersed defenses. Defense in depth was intended to nullify the Allies' growing material strength and succeeded in slowing the growth of Anglo-French battlefield superiority. The British Army continued its evolution into a mass army capable of imposing itself on a continental power, took on much of the military burden borne by the French and Russian armies since 1914, and left the German army resorting to expedients to counter the development of its increasingly skillful use of firepower and technology. During 1917, the British Army also experienced the manpower shortages that hampered the French and Germans, and then at Cambrai in December, encountered the revitalizing effect on the German army of reinforcements from Russia. Background: Hindenburg and Ludendorff replaced Chief of the General Staff Erich von Falkenhayn at the end of August 1916 during the most serious crisis of the war. On the 2nd of September, the new leadership ordered a strict defensive at Verdun and the dispatch of forces from there to reinforce the Somme and Romanian fronts. Hindenburg and Ludendorff visited the Western Front and held a meeting at Cambrai on the 8th of September with the Army Group and other commanders, at which the gravity of the situation in France and the grim prospects for the new year were debated. Hindenburg and Ludendorff had already announced a reconnaissance on the 6th of September for a new, shorter line behind the Noyon salient. On the 15th of September, a defensive strategy was announced except for Romania, and General Feldmarschall Rupprecht was instructed to prepare a new line, Arras Street, Quentin-Lao and Aisne River. The new line across the base of the Noyon salient would be about 30 miles shorter and was to be completed in 3 months. These defenses were planned with the experience gained on the Somme, which showed a need for much greater defensive depth and many small, shallow concrete manshaft size and beaten and to stand, rather than elaborate entrenchments and deep dugouts, which had become man-traps. Work began on the 23rd of September. 2 trench lines about 200 yards apart were dug as an outpost line and a main line of resistance on a reverse slope, behind fields of barbed wire up to 100 yards deep. Concrete machine gun nests and mebu shelters were built either side of the main line, with artillery observation posts built farther back to overlook it. On the 31st of August, Hindenburg and Ludendorff had begun the expansion of the army to 197 divisions and of munitions production in the Hindenburg program, necessary to meet demand after the vast expenditure of ammunition in 1916. 1916 and the anticipated increase in artillery use by the Allies in 1917. It was intended that the new defensive positions would contain any Allied breakthrough and give the German army the choice of a deliberate withdrawal, to dislocate an expected Allied offensive in the new year. Over the winter of 1916–1917, the wisdom of a deliberate withdrawal was debated, and at a meeting on the 19th of December, called after the 15th of December debacle at Verdun, the possibility of a return to the offensive was also discussed, with a maximum of 21 divisions expected to be available by March 1917. A decisive success was considered impossible. Ludendorff continued to vacillate, but in the end, the manpower crisis and the prospect of releasing 13 divisions by a withdrawal on the Western Front to the new Siegfriedslung overcame his desire to avoid the tacit admission of defeat it represented. The Alberic Bewegung was ordered to begin on the 16th of March 1917, although a withdrawal of 3 miles on a 15-mile front had already been carried out from 22–23 February in the salient between Bapaume and Arras, formed by the Allied advance on the Somme in 1916. The local retirements had been caused by the renewal of pressure by the British Fifth Army, as soon as weather permitted in January 1917, which had advanced 5 miles on a 4-mile front up the Ancre Valley. German defensive preparations early 1917. Third, on the 29th of August 1916, Hindenburg and Ludendorff had been appointed to the Oberstheeresleitung of the German army, after the sacking of General Erich von Falkenhayn, who had commanded the armies of Germany since September 1914. The new commanders, who became known as the Third Earl, had spent 2 years in command of Ober-Ost, the German section of the Eastern Front. Hindenburg and Ludendorff had demanded reinforcements from Falkenhayn to fight a decisive campaign against Russia and intrigued against Falkenhayn. Over his refusals, Falkenhayn held that decisive military victory against Russia was impossible and that the Western Front was the main theater of the war. Soon after taking over from Falkenhayn, Hindenburg and Ludendorff had no choice but to recognize the wisdom of Falkenhayn's judgment that the Western Front was decisive. Despite the crisis in the East caused by the Brusilov offensive and the Romanian declaration of war on the 28th of August, Cambrai Conference on the 8th of September, Hindenburg and Ludendorff held a conference at Cambrai with the chiefs of staff of the armies of the West here as part of a tour of inspection of the Western Front. Both men were dismayed at the nature of trench warfare that they found, in such contrast to the conditions on the Eastern Front and the dilapidated state of the West here. The Battle of Verdun and the Battle of the Somme had been extraordinarily costly, and on the Somme, 122,908 German casualties had been suffered from the 24th of June to the 28th of August. The battle had required the use of 29 divisions, and by September, a division a day had to be withdrawn and replaced by a fresh one. General Hermann von Kuhl, the Chief of Staff of Heeresgruppe Deutsche Kronprinz, reported that conditions at Verdun were little better and that the recruit depots behind the Army Group front could supply only 50 to 60% of the casualty replacements needed. From July to August, the West here had fired the equivalent of 587 trainloads of field gun shells, for the receipt of only 470 from Germany. creating a munitions shortage. The First Army on the north side of the Somme reported on the 28th of August that the complications of the entire battle lay only in part with the superiority in number of enemy divisions, for our infantry feel completely the superiority of the English and French in close battle. The most difficult factor in the battle is the enemy's superiority in munitions. This allows their artillery, which is excellently supported by aircraft, to level our trenches and to wear down our infantry systematically. The destruction of our positions is so thorough that our foremost line merely consists of occupied shell holes. It was known in Germany that the British had introduced conscription on the 27th of January 1916, and that despite the huge losses on the Somme, there would be no shortage of reinforcements. At the end of August, German military intelligence calculated that of the 58 British divisions in France, 18 were fresh. The French manpower situation was not as buoyant, but by combing out rear areas and recruiting more troops from the colonies, the French could replace losses, until the 1918 conscription class became available in the summer of 1917. Of the 110 French divisions in France, 16 were in reserve and another 10-11 divisions could be obtained by swapping tired units for fresh ones on quiet parts of the front. Ludendorff admitted privately to Generalleutnant Hermann von Kuhl, the chief of staff of Heeresgruppe Kronprinz Ruprecht von Bayern, who wrote in his diary that I spoke with Ludendorff alone. We were in agreement that a large-scale, positive outcome is now no longer possible. We can only hold on and take the best opportunity for peace. We made too many serious errors this year. On the 29th of August, Hindenburg and Ludendorff reorganized the army groups on the Western Front, by incorporating all but the Fourth Army in Flanders into the army group structure on the active part of the Western Front. The administrative reorganization eased the distribution of men and equipment but made no difference to the lack of numbers and the growing Franco-British superiority in weapons and ammunition. New divisions were needed and the manpower for them and the replacement of the losses of 1916 had to be found. The superiority in manpower enjoyed by the Entente and its allies could not be surpassed, but Hindenburg and Ludendorff drew on ideas from Oberseland and Max Bauer of the Operations Section at OL HQ in Mézières, for a further industrial mobilization, to equip the army for the material schlacht being inflicted on it in France, which would only intensify in 1917. Hindenburg Program. The new program was intended to create a trebling of artillery and machine gun output and a doubling of munitions and trench mortar production. Expansion of the army and output of war materials caused increased competition for manpower between the army and industry. In early 1916, the German army had 900,000 men in recruit depots and another 300,000 due in March when the 1897 class of conscripts was called up. The army was so flush with men that plans were made to demobilize older landwehr classes, and in the summer, Falkenhayn ordered the raising of another 18 divisions, for an army of 175 divisions. The costly battles at Verdun and the Somme had been much more demanding on German divisions, and they had to be relieved after only a few days in the front line, lasting about 14 days on the Somme. A larger number of divisions might reduce the strain on the West here and realize a surplus for offensives on other fronts. Hindenburg and Ludendorff ordered the creation of another 22 divisions, to reach 179 divisions by early 1917. The men for the divisions created by Falkenhayn had come from reducing square divisions with 4 infantry regiments to triangular divisions with 3 regiments, rather than a net increase in the number of men in the army. troops for the extra divisions of the expansion ordered by Hindenburg and Ludendorff could be found by combing out rear area units, but most would have to be drawn from the pool of replacements, which had been depleted by the losses of 1916, and although new classes of conscripts would top up the pool, casualty replacement would become much more difficult once the pool had to maintain a larger number of divisions. By calling up the 1898 class of recruits early in November 1916, the pool was increased to 763,000 men in February 1917, but the larger army would become a wasting asset. Ernst von Risberg, Abteilungschef of the Kaiserliche Obers- und Landsknechtsführer, had grave doubts about the wisdom of the increase in the expansion of the army, but was overruled by Ludendorff. The German army had begun 1916 equally well provided for in artillery and ammunition, massing 8.5 million field and 2.7 million heavy artillery shells for the beginning of the Battle of Verdun, but 4 million rounds were fired in the first fortnight, and the Fifth Army needed about 34 ammunition trains a day to continue the battle. The Battle of the Somme further reduced the German reserve of ammunition, and when the infantry was forced out of the front position, the need for fire to compensate for the lack of obstacles increased. Before the war, Germany had imported nitrates for propellant manufacture, and the war could only be continued because of the discovery of the Haber process to synthesize nitrates from atmospheric nitrogen, but developing the Haber process and building factories to exploit it took time. Under Falkenhayn, the procurement of ammunition and the guns to fire it had been based on the output of propellants. Since the manufacture of ammunition without sufficient propellant fillings was as wasteful of resources as it was pointless, but Hindenburg and Ludendorff wanted firepower to replace manpower and ignored the principle. To meet existing demand and to feed new weapons, Hindenburg and Ludendorff wanted a big increase in propellant output to 12,000 tons a month. In July 1916, the output target had been raised from 8,000 to 10,000 tons, which was expected to cover existing demand and the extra 2,000 tons of output demanded by Hindenburg and Ludendorff could never match the doubling and trebling of artillery, machine guns and trench mortars. The industrial mobilization needed to fulfill the Hindenburg program increased demand for skilled workers, Zurückgestellt or exempted from conscription. The number of Zurückgestellt increased from 1.2 million men, of whom 740,000 were deemed Kriegsverwendungsfähig, at the end of 1916 to 1.64 million men in October 1917 and more than 2 million by November, 1.16 million being KV. The demands of the Hindenburg program exacerbated the manpower crisis, and constraints on the availability of raw materials meant that targets were not met. The German army returned 125,000 skilled workers to the war economy and exempted 800,000 workers from conscription. From September 1916 to July 1917, steel production in February 1917 was 252,000 long tons short of expectations, and explosives production was 1,100 long tons below the target, which added to the pressure on Ludendorff to retreat to the Hindenburg Line. Despite the shortfalls, by the summer of 1917, the West-Tier artillery park had increased from 5,300 to 6,700 field guns, and from 3,700 to 4,300 heavy guns, many being newer models of superior performance. Machine gun output enabled each division to have 54 heavy and 108 light machine guns, and for the number of machining of air Scharfschützen and Abteilungen to be increased. The increased output was insufficient to equip the new divisions, and divisions which still had 2 artillery brigades with 2 regiments lost a regiment and the brigade headquarters, leaving 3 regiments. Against the new scales of equipment, British divisions in early 1917 had 64 heavy and 192 light machine guns, and the French 88 heavy and 432 light machine guns. Defensive battle. In a new manual of 1 December 1916, Grundsätze für die Führung in der Abwehrschlachtungsstellungskrieg, the policy of unyielding defensive ground regardless of its tactical value, was replaced by the defense of positions suitable for artillery observation and communication with the rear, where an attacking force would fight itself to a standstill and use up its resources while the defenders conserve the strength. Defending infantry would fight in areas, with the front divisions in an outpost zone up to 3,000 yards deep behind listening posts, with the main line of resistance placed on a reverse slope in front of artillery observation posts, which were kept far enough back to retain observation over the outpost zone. Behind the main line of resistance was a Großkampf zone of 2nd Defensive Area 1,500–2,500 yards deep, also sighted as far as possible on ground hidden from enemy observation, while in view of German artillery observers. A Rückordnungskampf zone further back was to be occupied by the reserve battalion of each regiment. Field fortification. Allgemeines Überstellungsbau was published in January 1917, and by April an outpost zone held by sentries had been built along the Western Front. Sentries could retreat to larger positions held by Stoßtrupps, who would join the sentries to recapture sentry posts by immediate counterattack. Defensive procedures in the battle zone were similar but with greater numbers. The front trench system was the sentry line for the battle zone garrison, which was allowed to move away from concentrations of enemy fire and then counter-attack to recover the battle and outpost zones. Such withdrawals were envisaged as occurring on small parts of the battlefield which had been made untenable by Allied artillery fire, as the prelude to Gegenstoß in der Stellung. Such a decentralized battle by large numbers of small infantry detachments would present the attacker with unforeseen obstructions. Resistance from troops equipped with automatic weapons, supported by observed artillery fire, would increase the further the advance progressed. A school was opened in January 1917 to teach infantry commanders the new methods. Given the Allies' growing superiority in munitions and manpower, attackers might still penetrate to the second line, leaving in the wake German garrisons isolated in wider Standsnester, still inflicting losses and disorganization on the attackers. As the attackers tried to capture the widers and dig in near the German second line, Sturm battalions and Sturmregimenter of the counter-attack divisions would advance from the Rückordnungskampf zone into the battle zone, in an immediate counter-attack. If the immediate counter-attack failed, the counter-attack divisions would take the time to prepare a methodical attack, provided the lost ground was essential to the retention of the main position. Such methods required large numbers of reserve divisions ready to move to the battlefront. The reserve was obtained by creating 22 divisions by internal reorganization of the army, bringing divisions from the Eastern Front, and by shortening the Western Front in Operation Alberic. By the spring of 1917, the German army in the West had a strategic reserve of 40 divisions. Somme analysis. Experience of the German First Army in the Somme battles was published on 30 January 1917. Ludendorff's new defensive methods had been controversial. During the Battle of the Somme in 1916, Colonel Fritz Von Lossberg had been able to establish a line of relief divisions, with the reinforcements from Verdun, which began to arrive in greater numbers in September. In his analysis of the battle, Fritz von Lossberg opposed the granting of discretion to front trench garrisons to retire, as he believed the maneuver did not allow the garrisons to evade Allied artillery fire, which could blanket the forward area and invited enemy infantry to occupy vacant areas. Lossberg considered that spontaneous withdrawals would disrupt the counter-attack reserves as they deployed and further deprive battalion and division commanders of the ability to conduct an organized defense, which the dispersal of infantry over a wider area had already made difficult. Lossberg and others had severe doubts as to the ability of relief divisions to arrive on the battlefield in time to conduct an immediate counter-attack from behind the battle zone. The skeptics wanted the Somme practice of fighting in the front line to be retained and authority devolved no further than battalion, so as to maintain organizational coherence in anticipation of a methodical counter-attack after 24 to 48 hours by the relief divisions. Ludendorff was sufficiently impressed by Lossberg's memorandum to add it to the new Manual of Infantry Training for War. 6th Army. General Falkenhausen, commander of the 6th Army, arranged his infantry in the Arras area according to Lossberg and Hohn's preference for a rigid defense of the front line, supported by methodical counterattacks by the relief divisions on the second and third day. 5 Ablassung's division were placed behind Way, 15 miles away from the front line. The new Hindenburg line ended at Telegraph Hill between Neuville-Vertas and Tilleur-les-Mouflaines, from whence the original system of 4 lines 75 to 150 yards apart ran north to the Neuville-Saint-Vaast-Bailleul road. About 3 miles behind were the Wancourt-Fuchy, and to the north the Pointe-du-Jour lines, running from the Scarpa River north along the east slope of Vimy Ridge. The new Wotan line, which extended the Hindenburg position, was built around 4 miles further back and not entirely mapped by the Allies until the battle had begun. Just before the battle, Falkenhausen had written that parts of the front line might be lost, but the 5 Ablassung's divisions could be brought forward to relieve the front divisions on the evening of the second day. On the 6th of April, General von Nagel, the 6th Army Chief of Staff, accepted that some of the front divisions might need to be relieved on the first evening of battle, but that any penetrations would be repulsed with local immediate counter-attacks by the front divisions. On the 7th of April, Nagel viewed the imminent British attack as a limited effort against Vimy Ridge, preparatory to a bigger attack later, perhaps combined with the French attack expected in mid-April. Construction of positions to fulfill the new policy of area defense had been drastically curtailed by shortages of labor and the long winter, which affected the setting of concrete. The 6th Army commanders had also been reluctant to encourage the British to change the plans if they detected a thinning of the front line and were inhibited by the extent of British air reconnaissance, which observed new fieldworks and promptly directed artillery fire on them. The 6th Army failed to redeploy its artillery, which remained in lines easy to see and bombard. Work on defenses was also divided between maintaining the front line, strengthening the third line, and the new Votants to Lung further back. Corps were detached from the component divisions and given permanent areas to hold, under geographical title on 3 April 1917. The 8th Reserve Corps, holding the area north of Givenchy, became Gruppe Souchet. 1st Bavarian Reserve Corps became Groupe Vimy and held the front from Givenchy to the Scarpa River with 3 divisions. Groupe Paris was responsible for the line from the Scarpa to Croisière, and Groupe Quéant from Croisière to Mauvais. Divisions would move into the area and come under the authority of the group for the duration of the term, then be replaced replaced by fresh divisions. Using the new defensive system, the 18th Division in the German First Army held an area of the Hindenburg position with an outpost zone along a ridge near Levaquiri and a main line of resistance 600 yards behind. The battle zone was 2,000 yards deep and backed onto the Hindenburg line. The 3 regiments held sectors with 2 battalions in the outpost and battle zones and 1 in reserve, several miles to the rear. The 2 battalions were side by side, with 3 companies in the outpost zone and front trenches, 1 in the battle zone, and 4 or 5 fortified areas within it, built of concrete and sited for all-round defense, held by 1 or 2 group and with a machine gun each. 3.5 companies remained in each front battalion area for mobile defense. During attacks, the reserve battalion was to advance and occupy the Hindenburg line. The new dispositions doubled the area held by a unit compared to July 1916 on the Somme.